In the opening scene of the movie PS, we see Louise getting ready for the day's work. Louise is a 39-year-old divorcee that works in the admissions office of Columbia University. After doing some things at work, she chats with Peter, her ex-husband who is also a staff member at Columbia University, during their break. Peter makes a little joke about her counting calories while she's eating. They get to know each other's weekend plans. Peter has a conference in Oregon, while Louise plans to do her manicure on Sunday. Louise is unhappy to know Peter had breakfast earlier that day with her brother Sammy so he could help him invest some money. She's unhappy with Peter having breakfast with Sammy, knowing full well that he's an addict, but Peter proves his point by saying that Sammy is already in recovery. Louise thinks there are other ways for Peter to get money and do the many things he claims he wants to do, instead of giving her brother his money to invest. After a few seconds of silence, Louise asks Peter to rate their marriage, and he believes their 10 years of marriage was at least better than most marriages. Louise agrees, since Peter is her best friend, despite the ups and downs. Back at her office, Louise receives a call from her friend Missy complaining to her about her husband's latest attitude towards her. Since her husband has made her feel invisible because he's embarking on a new project, Missy has decided to start hitting on the pool boy, and has also written a flirty note to her old flame Greg, which she'll have her husband send. Missy sees it as a way to let her husband know that she can go out to find what she needs but isn't getting from him. It appears Louise's marriage was better than most after all. Louise is about to head out of the office when she notices an application letter on the floor. When she picks it up, she recognizes the name, F. Scott Feinstadt, on the envelope, and is shocked. Sitting down, she picks out a cigarette to smoke as a way of calming down. Noticing that the application does not have attachment slides, Louise thinks it's a good opportunity to meet with the applicant and be sure he's not who she thinks he is. When she calls and states her reason for calling, he apologizes and promises to post them the next day. Louise quickly informs him that she has scheduled an interview with him, and he should bring the slides along. Scott is confused about the interview because he knows it's not required, but Louise persuades him that to be taken seriously, he should attend the interview. After scheduling the interview date for Monday at 12:30, they end their call. We'll soon get to know her reason for this. Going to her parents' house, Louise meets her mom in the kitchen cooking, and wonders what the occasion could be. Well, it's because Sammy is coming over. At this point, Louise's mood dampens and she goes off to her room. When she turns to go, her mom asks about Peter, and she reminds her again that she and Peter are divorced. Coming back down after going through some of her old stuff, Louise meets her mom and Sammy in the kitchen. Sammy notices the bag Louise is carrying and asks about it, and she claims it's some of her clothes. Louise then asks her mom about the Feinstadts and if they had any relatives. It turns out that the name F. Scott Feinstadt, that she saw on the application letter earlier that day, is the exact name of her high school boyfriend who passed away in a car crash. Her mom informs her that the Feinstadts retired to Florida and that it's just the two of them, he and his mom Rachel. It's another day at work, and Louise is still bothered about the name she saw on the application letter. She calls Missy to ask her a few things about Scott. Sitting down and facing the window, thinking of the next things to do, someone storms into Louise's office. It's F. Scott, whose application she received. After talking for a while and noticing some similarities between this Scott and her high school Scott, she tells him to show his slides. While he's arranging it, Peter knocks on the door and asks if they could meet at her place later that night. After coming to an agreement, he leaves. After arranging the slides, Scott calls Louise to take a look. While she's at it, the way she's looking at the slides makes Scott feel like they're not good enough. When she's done looking at the slides, she gives her remark and wants him to ask her any questions he may have. But he claims not to have any, then he leaves the office. Not pleased with the way Scott left her office, Louise goes after him. She then offers to tell him everything he needs to know about the school, and he agrees. So she takes him to her house. At the house, Louise goes to get a drink for her and Scott. When she comes back, he's there staring at a painting on the wall, and they talk a bit about it. Settling down to the wine Louise brought, Scott asks her if anyone has ever painted her portrait. But it's been a long time. Scott wants to paint a portrait of her, and Louise is shocked. Scott takes her hand, and begins to run lines through her hand and up to her shoulder and then chest. Louise just sits there, speechless. When they can't resist the urge any longer, they kiss. Scott is quite confused at the way everything is happening, and asks Louise if it's okay, and she agrees. After getting laid, Scott is scared that what just happened between both of them will hurt his chances of admission. At the sound of her work, she remembers, and thinks it's time for her to get back. Scott offers to take her on a proper date the next night, and she's happy with it. He borrows Louise's phone to call his mom, so her mind will be at rest about the unusual interview. After Scott gets off the phone with his mom, he asks to use the shower. Before Scott goes into the bathroom, Louise makes him promise her that he'll see her the next night, as they planned earlier. When Louise gets back to the office, one of her colleagues notices she changed her clothes from what she had on earlier that day. On getting into her office, she goes to take another look at the slides, and while she's doing that, Missy calls her. Missy has been calling her when she wasn't around, and Louise claims she took a long break. Missy gives her the news that Greg, to whom she sent a flirty note, called her earlier that morning and invited her to a hotel for an afternoon of hot nostalgic sex. Missy proudly informs Louise that she agreed to his invitation. At this point, Missy is already on her way to meet Greg in an SUV, and she sounds very excited. She's 2 blocks from the hotel, but she has turned back and is driving back home. Her reason is because the last time Greg saw her naked was quite a long time ago. She was 22 and was still perfect as a girl, but now she's a housewife that has given birth to twins, and she's very sure that the way she is now is not what Greg will be expecting. Missy guesses from the way Louise sounds on the phone that she's getting laid, but Louise acts like she has no idea what Missy is talking about. But Missy can't be fooled, because she has known Louise, and weirdly, she even knows the way she sounds when she's getting laid. But Louise still refuses to say a thing about her affair with Scott. Remembering her meeting with Peter that evening, Louise waits for him while he's attending to some of his students. When he's done with his students, he walks up to her and commends her looks, but she ignores him. Settled down at Louise's place, Peter asks her how she's faring, and she tells him she's wonderful. Peter agrees with her that she looks wonderful. Peter is also faring well. Peter uses the opportunity to reveal that he didn't go alone to Oregon the previous week, but went with someone else. He doesn't want Louise to hear the news from somewhere else. That's why he's telling her about it himself. Louise asks if the girl he went with is a student, but she is not. Instead, Peter met her through Sammy. Peter becomes nervous and asks for a cigarette. Louise doesn't think all is well, because the normal Peter doesn't smoke, but he claims to do so on a few occasions. After Louise gives Peter a cigarette and helps him light it, he starts to narrate how he met the girl. Some months ago, he went to Sammy for help, because he had a sex addiction that started before he got married to Louise. Louise is surprised, because in the last 3 years of their marriage before the divorce, they didn't have sex, which means he was getting it from another woman. Even though Peter had always sworn to himself every semester not to go back to it, just looking at a list of names on his desk makes the whole cycle come back again. Louise becomes sober, and tears drop down her eyes at the thought of her being on the list, and probably that's how Peter met her, but he assures her that she was different. Louise is shocked to learn that he has had intercourse with hundreds of women. As if that is not enough, he mentions there were men included too. Louise is shocked and broken at this news. Peter claims Sammy helped him to get through the addiction. At this point, Louise concludes that Peter may be in a relationship with her brother, but he explains to her that he went to Sammy for help because he saw the way he handled his addiction. Sammy helped Peter get into a program that could help him with his addiction, and it's during the program that he met the lady he went to Oregon with, Farah. Louise mockingly asks if Farah is also a sex addict, but Peter tells her that Farah's addiction is. However, what he thinks is worse is that throughout his marriage with her, he blamed her for everything that was happening. But the more he acted out, the less she seemed to notice, and this is because she had an idea of him being perfect, and always clung to this idea and wouldn't let it go. Even though he was desperate for her to catch him, the idea she had of him never let her see it. Peter is tired of hiding the secret, and now, he's ready to repair the damage he has done. Louise screams at him, while Peter tries to explain that he's just trying to repair the most important relationship he's had in his lifetime. Louise is not even ready to listen to whatever he has to say, because she's already broken with the things she's heard, so she tells him to leave her house. He does so without hesitation and without arguing any further. What a revelation. The next day, Louise thinks of all Peter told her the previous day. There's a knock at the door. When she opens the door, it's Scott, and he hugs her before he enters inside and shuts the door behind him. Scott notices her mood and wonders if he's the reason she's sad, but she reveals it's about Peter, her ex-husband. Scott didn't know Louise was married, and this shocks him. Louise reminds him that they just met the previous day, and she's 39 years old. Louise notices she snapped at Scott and it wasn't necessary, so she apologizes to him and explains to him that what Peter told her about their marriage is what's making her devastated. Scott wants to know if it's that Peter cheated, but Louise immediately snaps that maybe Peter would have f***ed Scott at some point. Scott believes Peter is jealous and probably wants her back. Louise starts to think so too. Scott tells her he can relate to his jealousy because, at this point, he's jealous that she's talking about Peter when he has been thinking about her all day and is finally here with her. He wants her to forget about Peter for the night and let it just be about both of them. From there, Scott takes Louise to a restaurant. While Louise is eating, Scott informs her of his plans in getting a studio, because he needs a second plan if Columbia does not work out. Louise is quite impressed, and she realizes he's working from his mom's basement currently. Scott is so passionate about painting that he believes if he couldn't paint he'd probably go crazy. At this point, Louise is probably thinking that the Scott sitting beside her may be a reincarnation of her high school boyfriend. This makes Louise ask what he'd do if he was driving and he hit a tree that made him fly out of the windshield, and his answer marvels her. He would take all the debris from the crash and turn it into art. They kiss before asking for dessert. While Scott and Louise are kissing, one of Scott's friends calls his attention, and he quickly goes to attend to him. Scott comes back to Louise with his friend, Ricky, and introduces him. Ricky jokingly advises Louise not to trust Scott. Ricky is his friend from his old neighborhood. He helped him lie to his mom last week that he was at his house, but he wasn't. Scott assures her it was before they met. Scott takes Louise to an inner part of the restaurant. Scott knows Louise is thinking that he's too young for her. Louise is surprised at how he knows this, and he claims it's because he has powers, and even persuades her to let him show his powers. Scott then tells her to think of her best friend, and then he puts his hands over her eyes to perform the magic. When he removes his hand, he reveals it's a woman, and gives other descriptions that best describe Missy. On even mentioning Missy's name, Louise is very shocked, and asks Scott how he knew about Missy. He claims to know everything he needs to know about her, and Louise is speechless. He then starts laughing at the prank he just pulled, and reveals he spoke with Missy on the phone the previous day. He was dripping wet and he came running out of the bathroom, and it was Missy on the phone. At this point, Louise thinks it's time for them to get home, and Scott agrees. They arrive at her house, and as Scott is about to sit down, Louise stops him and tells him to take off his clothes, and he does so at once. Then she tells him to walk back and forth, and while he does so, she says he'd make a good-looking corpse. Surprisingly, he does not get angry. He believes it's the best thing about passing young. After the whole pretend game, Scott thinks she's angry about Peter, and probably that's why she's taking it out on him. But Louise shuts him up with a kiss. Louise wakes up the next morning, and Scott is no longer laying down beside her. Next, Louise visits her mom. She notices the sad look on her daughter's face and asks her what the problem is, but just as Louise is about to answer, she breaks down in tears and goes to lie with her mom. She then reveals to her mom that Peter has a girlfriend. Louise and her mom are in the garden together when she asks her how she found out about Peter's girlfriend, and she reveals that Peter told her about it. Later, Louise wonders why her mom baked a pie, even though she is not sure if Sammy would be coming, but she just baked it in case. Later that night, Louise goes into the house, and Sammy is there eating the pie. She walks up to him, asking about Peter. Sammy defends himself that there's no way he could have told her, because Peter told him not to tell her, and she should have figured it out herself because it's not his responsibility. Louise gets angry and snaps at Sammy for being an old man who is still eating pie in his mother's kitchen, the same mother he stole from. Things get heated up real quick as Sammy also gets angry and calls her out, that at least he's there with their mother, but she's doing nothing but just sitting in her office and watching her marriage fall apart. They sit there arguing, and Sammy eventually leaves angrily, after telling her to stop feeling sorry for herself and work out the problem. Louise just sits alone at the table quietly, and after some time, gets up in a rush. Louise boards a taxi and goes to see Missy at the hotel she's lodged at. Missy is surprised at how Louise found her. When Louise reveals that it's through pattern recognition, Missy feels she sounds like Sammy. Louise is quite confused that Missy recognizes the way Sammy talks. This makes Missy reveal that Sammy is helping her with some investments. When Louise settles down, Missy tells her she saw Scott, and she also believes that he's a reincarnation of their high school Scott. While they smoke, Louise confirms Scott's story of the day she called her home line and Scott picked up the phone. The words he was saying, the sound of his voice, and the way he was making her feel was just like their high school Scott. He made her feel like the real person she is. Since Louise didn't want to tell her everything about Scott, she did her search by herself and rang him over at Ricky's. Meanwhile, Louise didn't want to tell Missy anything about Scott because she knew she'd try to steal him, just like she did with Scott when they were in high school. Louise is shocked that Missy even knows Ricky. Missy had gotten Scott's mom's number from the phone book and called her, pretending she was from Columbia University, and after getting to him, she invited him for brunch and they had a blast. Scott was full of questions about Louise. Louise is relieved that Missy did not mention their high school Scott. Missy proudly claims that she made a little progress, because at least she touched Scott. At this point, it's as if Louise can't take it any longer, so she goes into the bathroom to ease herself, and she sees Ricky's address on a piece of paper. She picks it up before Missy rushes inside the bathroom. Missy advises Louise to calm down, and at least remember that they both loved the high school Scott. But Louise snaps at her and angrily makes it known that they are not sharing Scott this time. Then she walks out, still in a rage. Missy walks behind her, reminding her that Scott dumped Louise because of her. Then she took pity and shared Scott with her, and he was still hers till when he was deceased. They both go on, arguing and fighting over a man that is already late, with their different imagined lives with him. Even though Missy doesn't support it, Louise leaves the hotel with the conclusion to tell Scott everything. Louise, on getting out of the taxi, sees Scott sitting outside, and she's surprised. He's there waiting for her, because Missy called him informing him that Louise has something important to tell him. Louise suggests they go inside to talk, but Scott doesn't want to, because he thinks Louise is there to end things with him. She assures him that's not her reason for asking to see him. Louise reveals everything to him. After the whole narration, Scott calms Louise down and tries to explain to her that heartbreak happens to everybody, and that people are just meant to learn from the experience and move on with life. But Louise thinks that people moving on is the problem. At this point, Scott stands up, already fed up with the way Louise is raising her voice at him. He doesn't want to fight, and he walks away. On getting back home, Louise meets Peter in her room. He feels sorry for hurting her with his confession, but he just wanted to tell her the truth and didn't mean to hurt her. Louise feels for him and puts her hand around his shoulders. The next morning, a loud knock wakes Louise. On opening the door, Scott rushes into the house and meets Peter. Since they've not met before, he takes a wild guess at his identity, and Peter demands to know who he is. Louise answers immediately that he's an MFA applicant, and Scott, on hearing this, is unhappy and asks her if she's insane. Peter, oblivious to what's happening, stands up to caution Scott and understand what the problem is. Seeing that Scott may say something, Louise suggests that Peter leaves, but he prefers to stay. Seeing the way Scott is talking, Peter warns him to watch his tongue. At this point, Louise wants Peter to leave her to handle the situation, and he agrees with a promise to call her. When Peter leaves, Scott flares up that Louise still came back home the previous night to sleep with her husband after she messed up with his head. She reveals that they didn't sleep together. Scott is angry that she simply breaks up with him, tells him he's deceased, and expects him to walk away. While Scott is pouring out his heart to Louise, she calls him F. Scott, since that's the normal name she always called him. But he tells her his name is Francis Scott Fainstedt, and people call him Fran. But he wrote F. Scott on the application because he thought it was cool. With anger, Scott mocks the mother and child painting that Louise's high school boyfriend gave to her, and he heads towards the door, but Louise goes after him and pulls him back in. He couldn't sleep the previous night because he was trying to wrap his head around all she told him, so he went and saw Missy. He does not reveal what happened between him and Missy, but just bids her farewell and leaves. An angry Louise goes to confront Missy about what happened between her and Scott. Missy bluntly tells Louise without mincing words that she and Scott had sex. Louise is not shocked, but sad that her so-called high school best friend is always stabbing her in the back. So she demands to know why Missy did what she did. Missy boldly claims she did it with Scott because she had him. After arguing about who said terrible things to whom the previous night, Missy leaves angrily. Louise has decided to put her life in order and face the right things that matter, so she calls Sammy to make up with him. Louise also meets up with Peter. Peter had been worried about Scott in Louise's house that day and wanted to call the police, but he let her handle it since she said she could. Peter walks towards Louise and stands by her side. Louise reveals that their relationship is never going to work. Although Peter doesn't think it'll happen that way if they love each other, Louise, on the other hand, believes that even with love for each other, their relationship is just never going to work out. After leaving Peter, Louise goes to the room where Scott's slides are displayed for assessment. She then invites Scott, who she now calls Fran, to her office and hands him his approved letter of application. At first, Scott thinks that Louise did it for him, but she reveals that his works are beautiful, and that's what paved the way for him. Happily, he thanks her genuinely. They both leave the office. While they're both speechless and confused about what to say, Scott gives Louise a peck, but she on the other hand goes in with a full kiss. Scott is happy, telling her he'll see her later, but instead, she tells him she knows where to find him. Then they go their separate ways. Could this be the beginning of a love tale? Will their love last despite their age difference? Only time will tell.